everyone, and welcome back. Or if this is your first time here on Inner Element, welcome. I'm really glad that you found your way to this particular episode because I think today's conversation is one of those that has a way of arriving at exactly the right moment for people who need it. And before we get into anything else, I just want to take a second and actually acknowledge you for being here, genuinely, because I know what it means to carve out time for something that isn't urgent, that isn't on your to do list, and that is just for you. That is its own little act of resistance for a lot of us. So, thank you for that. I want to start today with a question. And I want to invite you to actually hold it for a moment before I say anything else. When is the last time you actually checked in with your body? Not your inbox, not your calendar, not the group chat that's been going off since Tuesday, probably, not the version of yourself you have to be at work or for your family or in the spaces where you have to be professional and composed together. I mean, your actual physical embodied self, the one that woke up this morning and got you here, carrying everything that you're carrying. When did you last turn towards it with real curiosity and ask, how are you doing? And maybe more importantly, when did you last wait long enough to actually hear the answer? I've been sitting with this for quite some time because I think most of us, if we are honest, are operating in a kind of chronic disconnection with our own bodies. We have learned through culture, through survival, through the demands of high achievement, to treat the body as something to manage rather than something to listen to override it when it's inconvenient, to explain away its signals and keep moving. And the thing is, the body keeps talking anyway. It is extraordinarily persistent. It does not give up just because we stop paying attention. The tightness across your shoulders that lives there like an old tenant that you stopped noticing. The kind of exhaustion that no amount of sleep seems to fix. The headaches that show up right on schedule before a big deadline. And the stomach that knots itself up in certain rooms around certain people. The anxiety that has become so familiar that you've started calling it your personality. These are not random. These are not just stress. These are not character flaws. These are messages. Today, I want to talk about what happens when you finally start listening. I'm going to share something I haven't talked about in this much depth before. Something that's very about a specific morning about 2 years ago. And I think some of you are going to hear yourself in this story. We are going to go into the science, the stress response, the hormonal systems, and the mind body connection that mainstream medicine is only beginning to take seriously. And I'm going to talk about what it looks like to not just hear your body, but to bring what you hear to the right people, to your doctor, to your care team, and to the people who are actually trained and equipped to help you make sense of it. And I want to be upfront about something before we go any further because I think it matters. I was a physician before I became a PhD researcher, before environmental health. I trained as a doctor. And I say that not to establish an authority over this conversation, but because it's a part of why I feel so strongly about what I'm going to say today. I have been on both sides of that exam table. I have been the clinician sitting across from the patient who was struggling to articulate something real and important. And I have been the exhausted person who didn't know how to bring her own body signals into a room and have them taken seriously. So, when I talk about listening to your body today, I'm not talking about diagnosing yourself. I'm also not talking about turning to the internet or to a podcast, including this one, for answers to questions that belong in a clinical conversation. I'm talking about building the self knowledge and the vocabulary to walk into your doctor's office and say, this is what I have noticed, and this is what's been happening, and I want to understand it. That is the partnership. That is what I want for you. This is In Her Element. I am your host, a physician turned public health researcher, a PhD candidate in environmental health, and an Indian woman navigating academic spaces that were not built for me, and someone who has spent the last 2 years learning very slowly and imperfectly to be in a relationship with my body instead of at war with it. So let's get into it. I need to take you back to about 2 years ago. I was deep in my PhD program in environmental health, work that I genuinely love studying about, our environment, how it shapes human health in ways that are often invisible and almost always inequitable. The kind of work that still gets me out of bed in the morning because it feels urgent, necessary, and real. But here is the irony I could not see at that time. I was spending my days studying how chronic exposure to invisible stressors accumulates in the body over time, how the toll quietly builds until it isn't quite anymore, while completely ignoring what my own internal environment was telling me. I was the researcher who couldn't read her own data. And perhaps more painfully, the physician who couldn't apply her own training to herself. I remember this morning very clearly. My calendar was full. I had a presentation, a meeting I probably wasn't prepared for, 2 weeks of emails I'd been avoiding, and a paper going nowhere. Woke up, I sat up, and I just sat there. My chest felt like something was pressing on it from inside. My body felt like wet concrete, heavy in a way, that sleep hadn't or couldn't help because I just wasn't for months. My hands, when I look at them, were trembling slightly, just enough that I noticed, and then immediately tried to explain away. I got to the edge of the bed. I tried to stand, and something in me, quietly, firmly, without any drama, said no. What I want you to understand is that this did not look like a breakdown from the outside. I got up eventually, made it through most of my day that day. I sent the emails, I showed up, but that day something had cracked open. The story that I had been telling myself, that I was fine, that this was just what the season was supposed to feel like, that everybody in PhD was exhausted and running on literally on fumes, that story had developed a hole I could no longer paper over. It was because high functioning burnout doesn't look like falling apart. It looks like you're holding it together so tightly that your body has no choice to force the breakdown for you. And I want to be very specific here because I think we do each other a disservice when we talk about hard seasons in a very vague, manageable sounding terms. So let me be very specific. The anxiety had been building for a very long time, but I had gotten very good at managing in the margins, functioning during the day, quietly coming apart at night, chronic tightness across my upper body, back, and shoulders. So constant that it had become my baseline. Headaches I treated as like background noise. Digestive symptoms, acidity I kept attributing to my diet or coffee. Waking up tired, going to sleep anxious. And underneath all of this, something harder to name, but maybe the most important thread in this whole story, my body was showing me signs I didn't yet have language for. There were skin changes, mood shifts that felt so disproportionate to what was happening on the surface. Energy that crashed in ways that I couldn't predict or explain. I filed it all under stress, which was partially true, but it was also only half of the story. The other half was hormonal. And I want to talk about that in real terms with the real science, because I think it is one of the most under acknowledged dimensions of what high achieving women under chronic stress are actually experiencing in their bodies. And I also want to say this clearly right here. If you are recognizing yourself in any of these symptoms, please bring them to your doctor, not to a wellness account, not to a podcast, to a real clinician who knows your history, who can examine you, who can order the right labs and interpret them in the context of who you actually are. What I can offer today is language and awareness and conversation that might help you walk into that appointment better prepared. But your doctor is your partner in this. And most of them, I say this as one of them, genuinely want to help you. So let's start with what was actually happening in my body, because knowing the biology doesn't just explain things, it transforms the narrative from a person feeling into a physiological reality. And that reframe matters more than I can tell you. Chronic stress, not acute, not short term, low grade, relentless. This is just my life kind. Chronic keeps the body stress response system in a state of sustained activation. Cortisol, which is the primary stress hormone, is released by the adrenal glands in response to perceived threat. Now, in short bursts, cortisol is adaptive. It sharpens focus, it mobilizes energy, and helps respond to demands. But when cortisol remains chronically elevated, its effects become more damaging across nearly every system in your body. Researchers use the concept of allostatic load to describe this cumulative biological toll. This is basically compound interest on your physiology. Every day, the stress response stays activated without adequate recovery, the burden accumulates. Dysregulated cortisol rhythms, elevated inflammatory markers, suppressed immune function, impaired memory, and concentration, disrupted sleep, cardiovascular strain. The body quite literally keeps score. Now, the World Health Organization formally recognizes burnout as an occupational phenomenon. It is characterized by emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, and reduced personal accomplishment. But what often gets left out of that clinical definition is that burnout is also embodied. It changes the brain's structure and function. It dysregulates your inflammatory pathways. It impairs the executive function that you're relying on to do the other work that is burning. Now, what I was experiencing that morning wasn't some sort of a weakness. It was my nervous system at the very end of a long rope, doing exactly what nervous systems do when they even when they are asked to sustain too much for too long without recovery. My body was not failing me, it was communicating to me. Now, I want to talk about something that I think is profoundly underrepresented in conversations about women's health and burnout, and that is hormones. Specifically, what chronic stress does to hormonal systems in women's bodies, and why so many of us are walking around with imbalances that are being missed or never connected to the stress that we are carrying. And before I go into the science here, I want to say something that's very important. Everything I'm about to share is meant to help you understand what might be happening in your body, not to help you diagnose yourself. The symptoms I'm going to describe overlap with a lot of different conditions. And the only way to know what's actually going on is to work with a physician who can look at the full picture. Please use this as a context for a conversation with your doctor, not as a conclusion. Now, here's what we need to understand: the HPA axis in our body, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenaline axis. This is the central stress response system of the body. And it is also deeply intertwined with the hormonal systems that regulate the menstrual cycle, thyroid function, and metabolic health. These are not separate systems. They share an infrastructure. And when one is dysregulated, the other feels it. When cortisol is chronically elevated, it actively suppresses the production of progesterone through a mechanism sometimes called as progesterone steal. The body, under sustained stress, diverts the hormonal precursor, pregnenolone, away from progesterone production and towards your cortisol synthesis instead. Now, progesterone is essential for menstrual cycle, mood stabilization, sleep quality, and thyroid function. When progesterone is chronically low relative to estrogen, a state called estrogen dominance, where women can experience irregular periods, heavier painful periods, worsened PMS, anxiety, poor sleep, brain fog, and weight changes. Now, symptoms that are often dismissed as just hormones rather than recognized as the downstream effects of a body under sustained stress. Now, chronic stress also disrupts the HPG axis, the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis, which governs the reproductive hormones. Sustained cortisol elevation suppresses gonadotrophin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, which reduces your luteinizing hormone and the FSH from pituitary, which then reduce estrogen and progesterone production from the ovaries. Now, the body under chronic threat essentially deprioritizes reproduction in favor of survival. This can manifest as irregular or missed cycles and ovulation and worsen symptoms of conditions like PCOS or endometriosis. And then there is the thyroid, which regulates metabolism, energy, mood, and body temperature, and which is exquisitely sensitive to stress. Chronic cortisol elevation suppresses thyroid stimulating hormone, reduces the conversion of inactive T4 into active T3, and promotes the production of reverse T3, which blocks your thyroid receptors rather than activating them. And the result can be persistent fatigue, brain fog again, difficulty with weight, cold intolerance, hair changes, and a kind of whole body sluggishness that nothing seems to fix. Now, I want to pause here because I know that the list of symptoms might be landing in very specific ways for you. Maybe you've been experiencing these things for months, maybe years, and you've attributed them to being tired, to getting older, or to not doing enough. Maybe you've brought them to a doctor and been told your labs are normal. Here's what I want to say about speaking as a physician. Normal on a standard panel is not always the whole answer. Context matters, timing matters, the clinical picture matters. And if you feel like your labs have come back normal, but you still don't feel well, that is a conversation worth continuing, not a conclusion to accept. Genuinely want to get to the bottom of it with you. Most of us went into medicine because we cared about exactly this kind of puzzle. The patient who is clearly struggling and whose answer isn't showing up in the obvious places yet. Bring your symptoms back. Bring specificity. Bring your tracking if you've been doing it and ask the questions. Because research from women's health shows consistently that women's pain and symptoms are most likely attributed to psychological causes, more likely to be undertreated, and more likely to be dismissed, particularly for women of color. Studies on endometriosis show an average diagnostic delay of 7 to 10 years. The hormonal and stress related dimensions of women's health have been chronically under researched and undertaught. The gap between what women experience and what medicine has historically acknowledged is not a small one. That is a structural failure. It's not an individual one. I named that structural reality not to discourage you from engaging with your healthcare, but to validate the experience of those who have felt dismissed. Your experience was real, your symptoms were real, and you deserve a provider who takes that seriously. Which brings me to something, and I want to say directly. If you've seen a doctor and not felt heard, please try again. With the same doctor, if you think the relationship is worth continuing, or with a different one if it isn't. Finding the right physician, someone who listens, who is curious alongside you, who treats you as a whole person and not just as a set of labs, is sometimes a process. It takes more effort than it should, and that is genuinely unfair. But those doctors exist. I promise you they exist, and you're worth the search. The burnout that I was feeling 2 years ago wasn't just about the workload or the specific demands of PhD. There was something running underneath all of it, I think is worth naming honestly. I grew up watching my parents build a life through work, relentless, purposeful, loving work, and I absorbed that equation. Effort equals worth. Rest is earned only after something is done. In the spaces I was navigating, academic spaces, professional spaces, immigrant spaces, you prove your right to be there through output, through excellence, and through never visibly struggling. And then I walked into a PhD program, and all of that conditioning got amplified. Because when you're already carrying a quite ambient question about whether you belong, the answer you reach for is always work harder, prove it again, be more. There is also something specific that happens when you are an empath in a high achieving or high pressure spaces. You're not just carrying your own stress, you're also carrying the stress of your cohort, your advisor's expectations, your family's hope, your research field's urgent reminders of how much suffering exists in the world. All of it lives somewhere, and for me, it lived in my body. There is a difference between strength and the performance of strength, and for a long time, I had been performing. And the cultural conditioning I just described has a research footprint to it. Studies on burnout among women of color in professional and academic settings describe what researchers call the minority tax, the additional, often invisible labor that falls disproportionately on underrepresented groups. The code switching, the constant calibration of how you present yourself, the informal mentoring, the committee and representation work that rarely comes with reduced expectations elsewhere. There's also a documented phenomena in health disparities in research called John Hennerism, high effort coping with chronic psychosocial stressors, where individuals respond to persistent barriers by pushing harder than stepping back. Now, this pattern is associated with elevated rates of hypertension, systemic inflammation, and chronic disease. You cope brilliantly right up until you can't. Now, research on help seeking among women of color shows that they are simultaneously less likely to access mental health and medical support because of stigma, cultural norms around strength, and historically grounded distrust of systems that have not always served them, and more likely to experience the long term consequences of chronic unaddressed stress. Now, the gap between I am fine and I cannot function is often much narrower than it appears from the outside. I had turned endurance into identity, and the cultural messages that I had absorbed about strength had made it almost impossible for me to read my own exhaustion as information rather than weakness. And I have to acknowledge the thing that is both humbling and in retrospect a little funny. I study environmental health. I think of allostatic load, about how chronic invisible exposures accumulate in the body over time, about communities under constant and sustained threats and what it cost them. And I had placed myself entirely outside of that. The phrase, the body keeps score, comes from the trauma researcher Bessel van der Kolk. And it means exactly what it sounds like. Whatever we experience, whatever we don't fully process, the body holds it. It doesn't disappear, it metabolizes, it waits. It shows up eventually. My body had been keeping a score for a very long time. And I, the physician, the researcher, had convinced myself that I was an exception. None of us are the exception. The body does not care about your credentials or your commitment or how important the work is. It responds to load and recovery. That is it. The relationship between psychological stress and physiological health is one of the most well documented and consistently underappreciated areas in medicine. The brain and body are in constant bi-directional communication. What happens in the mind registers in the body, and what happens in the body shapes the mind. Chronic psychological stress triggers a sustained inflammatory response. Elevated pro inflammatory cytokines have been linked to depression, anxiety, cognitive impairment, and cardiovascular disease. The physical pain that accompanies periods of intense psychological stress is not imagined, it is physiological. The gut brain axis, the communication pathway between the gastrointestinal system and the central nervous system via the vagus nerve, explains why anxiety shows up as nausea, why stress disrupts digestion, why the gut is sometimes called the second brain. The enteric nervous system contains more neurons than the spinal cord. It is exquisitely responsive to psychological state. The body is not being dramatic, it is being extraordinarily communicative. Now, every symptom that I had been dismissing, the chronic tension, the exhaustion, the digestive disruption, headaches, anxiety with its own physical texture, was part of a coherent message. My nervous system trying every channel available to it, asking for something to change. What changed was not one big thing for me. It was very slow, non-linear, and imperfect, and I am still in the middle of correcting it. I started walking, and it wasn't to, have a step count of 10K steps. It was just to be outside, to move without any urgency or any destination in mind. There is something about moving through the world without an agenda that communicates something different to your nervous system. Like you are allowed to simply be here. You don't have to produce anything right now. It sounds small, but it was not small. I returned to meditation. I was very imperfect at first. What I found wasn't silence. My mind doesn't do that easily. And I have stopped expecting it to. What I found was space, the ability to notice what I was feeling and create just enough distance to respond rather than react. I started tracking my cycle seriously, my symptoms, energy levels, mood, sleep, capacity. My patterns became more visible to me. I could see that my anxiety spiked at specific points, that my energy was genuinely different across different phases. That's what I had been reading as random failure was actually a biological rhythm, predictable, workable, and informative. That map changed how I planned my weeks, how I communicated about my capacity, and how I understood myself. It also gave me something concrete to bring to my doctor. My specific patterns over time, what were much more useful than I have been feeling off. And I got more honest with my husband, with the people close to me. Less reflexively, I'm fine, and more actual truth about what I was feeling, what I was caring. I think that was the hardest part because at some point, the performance of capability becomes your identity, and letting it slip, even with the people who love you, feels like a free fall. But it was not free fall for me, it was landing. And here's what science says about practices that help me and why they work at a biological level. So, research on mindfulness based stress reduction show Measurable reductions in anxiety, depression, and chronic pain across dozens of well designed studies. At the neurological level, regular mindfulness practice is associated with decreased amygdala reactivity and increased connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and emotional processing regions. Now, the brain becomes more capable of pausing between stimulus and response. That is not metaphorical, that is a measurable neural change. And also, research on nature exposure, including Japanese studies on Shinroki or forest bathing, shows that even a brief time in green spaces reduces your salivary cortisol, lowers blood pressure and heart rate, and activates the parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and digest counterpart to chronic sympathetic activation. For bodies that have been running on high alert, this shift is restorative at a cellular level. And on sleep, during deep sleep, the brain's glymphatic system is 10 times more active than during waking hours, clearing your metabolic byproducts, including proteins that are linked to neurodegeneration. Chronic sleep deprivation impairs the prefrontal cortex, the seat of decision making, emotional regulation, and complex reasoning. The work you're sacrificing for sleep too gets worse the longer you sacrifice the sleep. That is neuroscience, not motivation. And on hormonal dysregulation specifically, there is growing evidence that lifestyle interventions like consistent sleep, stress reduction, reduced inflammatory load, cycle aware practices can actually meaningfully support hormonal balance. The body, given the right conditions, has a remarkable capacity to regulate itself. These interventions are not replacements for medical care, but they are what you do alongside your care to give your body the condition it needs to respond. Now, rest is not the opposite of productivity, it is actually a biological condition. It is the biological conditioning for it. And for women whose hormonal health is inextricably linked to their stress physiology, rest is not indulgence, it is actually medicine. I want to take some time and spend it on something that I think gets framed in a way that doesn't always serve us well: the idea of self advocacy in healthcare. It can sometimes get spun into this message of your doctor isn't listening, you have to fight the system, do your own research, trust your gut over the experts. And I understand why that narrative exists, because real dismissal happens and real harm has been done to real patients, especially women and especially women of color, by healthcare systems that were not built to take them seriously. But I want to offer you a more complete picture, because I've been a physician before and I was also a patient. And what I know from both sides of that relationship is this: most doctors genuinely want to help. Most of us went into medicine because we care, because we are drawn to exactly this kind of complexity, because there's nothing more meaningful than helping someone understand what is happening in their body and what to do about it. The relationship between you and your doctor is a partnership. And like any partnership, it works better when both people show up fully. So, here is what I actually mean when I talk about advocating for yourself in a medical setting. It means coming in with the specificity, not I've been really tired, but I've been experiencing persistent fatigue that is not resolved by sleep, along with irregular cycles and mood fluctuations in the week before my period, and difficulty concentrating. And I've been tracking this for 3 months, and here is what I have noticed. Your doctor can work with that. That level of detail is genuinely useful. It narrows the differential and it helps us help you. It means asking questions, not confrontationally, but curiously. What might explain these symptoms together? Is there anything additional we should look at? If this panel comes back normal and I still don't feel well, what would our next step be? These are not adversarial questions. These are the questions of a patient who is engaged and invested in their own care, and most doctors welcome them. It means trusting the relationship enough to say, I don't feel like we've found the answer yet, and the good doctor will not take that as a complaint. They will take it as a starting point for a longer conversation. And I want to say this with real care for those who have had genuine difficult experiences with healthcare. If you've brought your symptoms to a doctor and felt dismissed, not just once but consistently, you are allowed to seek a different provider. Find a physician you trust is not disloyal. It is good healthcare. Different doctors bring different trainings, different areas of focus, different communication styles, and sometimes the right fit just takes a little searching. But I want to distinguish between a doctor who dismisses you and a doctor who's doing their job carefully. Sometimes your labs are normal is genuinely reassuring, not dismissive. Sometimes the answer is that the symptoms you're experiencing are real and caused by stress, and the plan involves addressing the stress, not finding a pathological marker. That is not the same as being believed. That is medicine being honest about what it's seeing. So, what I'm asking you to not do is this: please don't diagnose yourself. Please don't take a list of symptoms you find online or heard on this podcast, including this one, and take and decide that you have that. The internet is full of information that is technically accurate but entirely wrong for your specific situation. I have seen patients come in convinced that they had a particular condition, and the process of untangling that certainty took time and energy away from finding what was actually going on. Bring your awareness to a professional. Bring your questions, bring your tracking, bring your honesty about what you've been experiencing, and then let them do their job. That partnership, your self knowledge combined with their clinical training, is far more powerful than either one alone. Your body signals are worth paying attention to, and they're also worth bringing to someone who trained to help you understand them. In a workplace setting, self advocacy looks like naming your limits before they become a crisis. Like saying, I'm at capacity this week, instead of silently adding more and burning through it. Like building in recovery not as a reward, but as a non negotiable feature of how you work. In your own inner life, self advocacy means resisting the voices that tell you your discomfort is an inconvenience rather than information, that your rest is something to earn rather than something you need. That voice has been taught to you by systems that benefit from your exhaustion. It is not the truth about you. Advocacy is an act of love, it is not a confrontation. It is saying, I take myself seriously enough to show up for my own health. I trust that I'm experienced enough to bring it to the people who can help. That is not a small thing. For many of us, it is a radical thing. And I want to close this with something that I've been sitting for with a long time. I think a lot of us have a complicated relationship with our bodies, complicated by years of being told that they are too much or not enough, too loud in their needs, too inconvenient in their timings, complicated by the ways that women's bodies in particular have been pathologized and dismissed and treated as sites of suspicion rather than sources of wisdom, complicated by the way that high achievement culture teaches us to treat the body as an instrument in the service of the mind rather than as a home. But the body is a home. It is the only home you will ever truly live in. And it is trying to be in conversation with you all the time. Every ache, every signal, every moment something shifts, it is all a part of that conversation. The question is not whether your body is speaking. The question is whether you've decided you're worth listening to. Here is what I know now, and I wish I had known 2 years ago. The exhaustion that sleep doesn't fix is not just a bad week. It is a pattern worth paying attention to, worth bringing to someone who can help you understand it. The cycle irregularities, the mood swings, the brain fog, these are not evidence that something is wrong with you. These are evidence that your body is responding to a load that may be heavier than that you have acknowledged. Write them down, track them, bring them in. The anxiety with its own physical texture, the chest tightness, the jaw you wake up clenching, that is your nervous system doing its job. And there are people, real clinicians, real therapists, real providers who care, who are trained to help you work with exactly that. And the fact that you've kept going through all of it, that you've continued to show up and contribute and care, is not evidence that everything is fine. Sometimes it is evidence of how good you've become at overriding yourself. I want to invite you to make a difference. Just a small, consistent turning toward, a little more attention, a little more willingness to treat your own signals as worthy of a response. Track your cycle if you haven't. Notice your patterns. Build in rest before you need it. And if something doesn't feel right, please bring it to your doctor. Not to the internet, not to a wellness influencer, not even to a podcast. To a real person who knows medicine, who can look at you as a whole person and figure out what is actually going on. And if you don't feel heard the first time, try again. A different appointment, a different day, a more prepared version of yourself with your symptoms written down. Or if you truly need to, a different doctor. But don't give up on the relationship between you and medicine. Most people in that field are there because they genuinely want to help, and you deserve to find the ones who do it well. My research gives me passion, it gives me purpose, and a connection to something larger than any given hard week. But my walks, my meditation, my honesty with people I love, and yes, finally going to my own doctor and saying, I need help understanding what's happening in my body, those things gave me the capacity to actually do the work. These are not luxuries, they are load bearing. They are the infrastructure beneath everything else. I'm still building mine every day. Some days are better than others, but I've stopped abandoning myself in the rush to keep going. And that, more than anything, is what changed. So, what is your body trying to tell you that your mind keeps ignoring? And who is the right person to help you make sense of it? Sit with that. You don't have to answer it right now, but let it land and come back to it every time you catch yourself explaining away something your body is trying to show you. Also, thank you for genuinely being here. If any part of this episode landed for you, if you heard yourself somewhere in this conversation, I want you to encourage it and share it with a friend who's been pushing too hard, with a colleague who keeps saying she's fine, or with someone who might not have the language yet for what they've been experiencing but might find it here. And if this episode gave you something to bring to your next doctor's appointment, please bring it. That is exactly what it is here for. If you've been meaning to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, now is the moment. It takes 2 minutes and it genuinely helps more people find the show. I read every single one. Coming up next episode, we will be shifting into the territory of purpose and path and what it looks like when the thing you worked so hard today towards stops feeling like the right thing, and what it means to trust yourself through that kind of disorientation. I've been wanting to have that conversation for a very long time. Until then, go take a walk, drink some water, check in with the home you live in. And if something isn't right, call your doctor, not Dr. Google, your actual doctor. You deserve that, and I'll see you in the next one.